My cousin, who has always been the golden child of the family, borrowed $177,000 from me, claiming he needed it to start a business. However, instead of investing the money, he spent it all on traveling and gambling. I took him to court, but my entire family took his side. Recently, he approached me again, asking for $7,000 for a new business venture, despite still owing me $3,000. Initially, I refused, but my parents pressured me into giving in. He promised to return the money within 6 months once his business was up and running. 6 months passed, and not only had he not started his business, but he had spent the $7,000 on himself. He traveled through Asia, bought a new gaming console, and gambled away the rest. I remember the day he came to me with his parents and mine. He claimed to feel terrible about how he had squandered the money and wanted to make things right. To do so, he asked for another $7,000, promising that this time he would really start the business. I laughed at him, but before I could say no, my aunt interrupted. She screamed that families should always help each other and pressured me relentlessly into giving him the money. The memory of being ganged up on like this resurfaced, and with my parents, aunt, uncle, and brother all towering over me, I let them bully me into giving him another $7,000. Darren would occasionally throw a few $100s at someone in need, but no one had ever asked him for something as significant as the $17,000 total I had loaned him. That was a whole different story. He was used to being the one offering help, not the one owing money. No one had ever asked him for something so big, and now that I had, he couldn't handle it. Eventually, I gathered the family together and confronted Darren, asking for the money in front of everyone. I looked around the room for some support when I voiced my concerns, but all I got were blank stares. My father just shrugged, while Darren sat there looking smug, arms folded like he had nothing to answer for. The silence was broken by the aunt whose credit card Darren had once paid off. She said I was overreacting, that family isn't just about money, and that I was creating a rift over something trivial. She threw in her usual "what if one of us died" card, trying to guilt trip me, but this wasn't about that I needed my money. She treated it like spare change, disregarding the fact that I had worked hard to save up that money. I sacrificed nights out with friends, worked overtime at both jobs, and budgeted every meal. Yet here was my family acting like it was no big deal that Darren had taken my hard-earned savings and used them to fund his lavish lifestyle. I reminded them that Darren had promised to pay me back, and it had been 6 months with nothing but excuses. Darren leaned back in his chair, arms crossed, and repeated the same line he'd been telling me for months: the money is tied up. As soon as the deal goes through, you'll get it back with interest. He asked me to trust him again. I did trust him, but every time I asked for an update, there was another excuse. Meanwhile, he was out living his best life while I was left wondering if I would ever see that money again. Before Darren could respond, my uncle, who had been silent until then, spoke up. He said he was disappointed to see us acting this way, and that Darren was doing something good for the future of the family. He claimed that in a couple of years, the $177,000 would mean nothing once we had millions, and that I should be proud to have helped Darren early on. My stomach dropped. I told him it was fine and left it at that, knowing I was wasting my time talking to them. It became clear that my family wasn't going to help me, so I decided to take matters into my own hands. Over the next few weeks, I stopped attending family gatherings. Every time I thought about seeing them, my stomach twisted. I began collecting evidence of Darren's spending habits. I knew he was blowing the money on luxury items, and while his Instagram posts were public, I needed solid proof. So, I started digging deeper. I looked into public records, tracked his purchases, and followed up on his supposed business investments. What I discovered confirmed my suspicions there was no business. Darren had used my $177,000 to buy a luxury car, take extravagant vacations, and furnish his apartment with high-end furniture. The tech startup he had claimed to be investing in didn't even exist. With all this information, I decided to consult a financial investigator. It was a difficult choice because it meant bringing an outsider into a family matter, but I realized it was the only way to hold Darren accountable. I didn't see any other option. The investigator was able to trace Darren's spending even further, compiling detailed reports that laid out exactly where my money had gone. As I reviewed the final report, I felt a strange mixture of relief and anger. Relief that I finally had concrete proof, and anger that I had allowed it to reach this point. But now, I had something undeniable. My plan was to present the evidence to my family, hoping that they would finally see the truth. When I called for another family meeting, I knew it wouldn't be easy, but I thought that with the evidence in hand, they might finally believe me. I was wrong. Sitting around the same dinner table, I presented everything: the investigators' report, public records, and screenshots of Darren's lavish spending. I even had a timeline that outlined how, from the day I lent him the money, Darren had been using it for personal gain. At first, the room was silent. I expected shock, maybe even some apologies for not believing me sooner, but what I got was disbelief. My mom immediately said that it couldn't be true and that Darren wouldn't do something like that. Darren tried to play it off, admitting that while some of the money went toward business expenses, he had spent a portion on himself. He explained that this was just how business worked. He needed to look successful to be successful. I confronted him again, telling him that he had taken my money under false pretenses and used it for his own benefit, which was fraud. At the mention of fraud, the room tensed. My father's face turned red, my uncle shifted uncomfortably, and my mom just stared at Darren, as if waiting for him to magically explain it all away. Darren, trying to defend himself, said he would repay every dime, but the damage was done. The evidence was clear: Darren had lied, and now everyone knew it. I thought I had him cornered. While he was playing checkers, I was playing chess. But despite the evidence, my family still sided with Darren. They refused to hold him fully accountable. My dad sighed, clearly frustrated, and said that Darren was under a lot of pressure and just trying to make something of himself. Mistakes happen, he said, but this wasn't a mistake. Darren didn't accidentally take my money and forget to pay it back. He lied, took what I had worked so hard for, and had no intention of returning it. My mom gave me a sad look, as if I was the one in the wrong. She suggested that maybe I should have given Darren more time, insisting that he wouldn't intentionally hurt me. Her words hit harder than I expected. How could they still see him as the victim? I was the one left hanging, but they acted like I was the problem. It wasn't about giving him more time, it was about trust, and Darren had shattered that. My uncle let out a heavy sigh, and for a brief moment I thought he might finally understand. But no, he just reminded me that family is more important than money, and they didn't want this to tear us apart. I stood up, feeling the weight of everything. I couldn't keep fighting them or pretending everything was okay. The next day, I went to my lawyer and filed a lawsuit against Darren for fraud. It wasn't an easy decision, but it was the only one I had left. My family had chosen to protect Darren at my expense, and I wasn't going to let that slide. I had worked too hard for that money to let it slip away without a fight. Once my lawyer served him the papers, I knew it would turn my family upside down. Darren, who had been avoiding me for months, suddenly couldn't stop calling. He begged me to drop the case, promising he'd find a way to pay me back. But the betrayal wasn't something I could easily forget. Darren's reputation was in tatters. No one trusted him anymore, so he couldn't pull his usual tricks of borrowing from one person to pay another. Eventually, I got my money back, which helped me make the down payment on my first house and even buy some new furniture. But Darren didn't stop there. When begging didn't work, he lashed out, accusing me of ruining his life. I wasn't buying it. I had heard his excuses too many times before. My parents were furious. To them, I was the one destroying the family, not Darren, but I wasn't backing down. The court proceedings dragged on for months, with Darren's lawyer trying to paint me as unreasonable. During the trial, I was shocked when my uncle took the stand to defend Darren. He testified that the money I gave Darren wasn't a loan but a contribution to support him, claiming that Darren had tried to get other family members to invest in his business too. He made it seem like I was just one of many who had offered help, as if that somehow justified everything. But the evidence spoke for itself. They didn't know that I had all the messages between Darren and me, where he clearly said he would pay me back. Between that, the investigator's report, Darren's spending records, and his own inconsistent testimony, it all pointed to one thing: fraud. In the end, the judge ruled in my favor. Darren was ordered to repay the full amount plus interest and was fined for his fraudulent actions. I wish the court ruling brought some closure, but the truth is, my relationship with my family was forever changed. They apologized after the ruling, but their apologies felt hollow. They had chosen Darren over me when it mattered most, and that's something I couldn't easily forget.